We live in interesting times for the headlines. China summons the U.S. ambassador and threatens retaliation after President Trump signs legislation supporting Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters. The death toll from the most powerful earthquake to strike Albania in decades rises to 40 after more bodies were pulled from the rubble overnight. North Korea fired 2 unidentified projectiles on Thursday, the Thanksgiving holiday in the U.S., Seoul said, as nuclear talks between Pyongyang and Washington remain deadlocked. And astronomers have discovered a black hole in the Milky Way with a mass 70 times greater than the Sun, so huge it challenges existing models of how stars evolve, according to researchers. I'm Alma Angeles, wherever you're watching from around the world. Thank you very much for joining us, and now to the news. China summoned the U.S. ambassador and threatened retaliation after U.S. President Donald Trump signed legislation supporting Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters just as the world's top 2 economies edge towards a trade truce. President Trump signed the legislation under heavy pressure from Congress, where it attracted rare bipartisan support, and in a statement spoke of his respect for Chinese President Xi Jinping, calling for both sides to amicably settle their differences. But Beijing lashed out furiously, summoning the U.S. ambassador and threatening unspecified firm countermeasures and warning Washington not to implement the legislation. The nature of this is extremely abominable and harbors absolutely sinister intentions, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said in a statement. In Hong Kong, the government expressed extreme regret after President Trump signed legislation requiring an annual review of freedoms in Hong Kong and banning the sale of crowd control equipment like tear gas. Now, the 2 acts are obviously interfering in Hong Kong's internal affairs, the city government said in a statement, warning the move would send the wrong message to the protesters. Now, the bill aims to check for possible erosion by the Chinese government of Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy under the one country, 2 systems principle. It would also allow for sanctions to be imposed on Chinese officials involved in suppressing Hong Kong. Meanwhile, Drew Thompson from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore gave his views on the passing of a U.S. law supporting pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. China had reacted angrily and threatened retaliation, but Mr. Thompson says he doesn't believe the act is a big blow to China. Take a look.
To say, I've heard some commentators, particularly in China, think that Hong Kong is now a card that the U.S. is going to play in trade negotiations, and I don't believe that to be the case. It's not something that the U.S. can either give or take away. So it's really not a good, it's not a good card. So I don't see it directly affecting negotiations. I don't see it affecting the overall relationship. The current state of the relationship is defined by a number of factors, not just the engagement between senior leaders. It's partly engagement between corporations, companies, individuals, educational institutions. It's a very broad, diverse, deep relationship. Again, I think the district council elections that took place last weekend probably had a much bigger impact on affecting calculations amongst the protesters than the Hong Kong Democracy Act. In my opinion, I think that's much more meaningful for the Hong Kong people, and potentially provides outlets for dissatisfied people to exercise their rights. I don't think the act itself or the law that the president signed is a big blow to China in any means. I think China often threatens vague countermeasures, but has trouble figuring out what those countermeasures should be. So that's not unusual. Certainly their frustration is clear, but beyond rhetoric, it's not clear how they'll respond. But I think, honestly, at the end of the day, Beijing is going to make its calculation about what to do based on the conditions on the ground in China. I don't think the U.S. is a major factor.
Meanwhile, Hong Kong police on Thursday entered a ransacked university campus where authorities faced off for days with barricaded pro-democracy protesters, gathering a huge haul of petrol bombs and other dangerous materials left over from the occupation. The Hong Kong Polytechnic University became the epicenter of the territory's increasingly violent protest movement when clashes broke out on November 17 between police and protesters armed with bows and arrows, as well as Molotov cocktails. University staff said they were only able to find a single protester on campus, and reporters there struggled to see any major presence in the last 48 hours. Late Wednesday, a lone masked man spoke to journalists inside the campus and said that some 20 protesters remained, but there was no sign of them on Thursday morning when police and firefighters moved in. Explosives experts went from room to room. Officers gathered a rapidly growing file of items in a courtyard, from half-full jerry cans of petrol to Molotovs made out of wine bottles and various chemicals in brown glass bottles. Crime scene investigators could be seen dusting multiple objects for fingerprints. Meanwhile, North Korea fired 2 unidentified projectiles on Thursday, the Thanksgiving holiday in the U.S., according to Seoul, as nuclear talks between Pyongyang and Washington remain deadlocked. The brief statement from the South's Joint Chiefs of Staff said Pyongyang fired 2 projectiles eastwards from South Hamgyong province, which came down in the Sea of Japan, also known as the East Sea. It said the launch was carried out at 16:59 p.m. local time, or the early hours in Washington, D.C., on one of the U.S. biggest annual holidays. It was also 1 day short of the 2-year anniversary of its first test of its Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile, which analysts say is capable of reaching the entire U.S. mainland. Japan's defense ministry described the projectiles as ballistic missile-like, but said they didn't come down in the country's exclusive economic zone. U.S. President Donald Trump has played down the recent launches, repeatedly pointing to North Korea's moratorium on nuclear tests and intercontinental ballistic missile launches as foreign policy successes for him. North Korea has issued a series of increasingly assertive comments in recent weeks as its end-of-year deadline for the U.S. to come up with a fresh offer approaches. President Trump hinted at the prospect of a 4th meeting with Kim in a tweet earlier this month, only to be rebuffed by the North, which said it had no interest in summits, quote, that bring nothing to us. A pair of storms packing heavy snow and hurricane-force winds wreaked havoc Wednesday, U.S. time, for Americans on the move for the Thanksgiving holiday. On one of the busiest travel days of the year in America, an estimated 55 million people planning to drive or fly, highways in the West and Midwest were closed because of snow, and hundreds of flights were canceled. A cherished staple, giant colorful character balloons floating through Manhattan during the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade might be grounded for Thursday's festivities because of gusting winds in the Big Apple. The National Weather Service said an extremely active weather pattern is in place across much of the U.S. A snowstorm that caused near whiteout blizzard conditions in Colorado dumped a foot of snow in Wyoming on Tuesday and was barreling eastward toward the Great Lakes region in the central U.S. At the airport in Denver, which was hit with a foot of snow, nearly 500 flights were canceled and another 500 were delayed. On Monday night, 1,000 people slept at the airport. The National Weather Service said while the 2 separate storms are expected to weaken Wednesday and Thursday, holiday travel would be affected through the weekend. It also warned of the potential of flash floods in Southern California through Thanksgiving Day because of heavy rain. And staying in the U.S., 3 people were injured in an explosion at a chemical plant in Texas on Wednesday, which sent a huge fireball into the sky and triggered a mandatory evacuation. Take a look.
We do recognize that we did impact a lot of folks off-site, and there's obviously been reported damage, physical damage to residencies, glass broken, doors jammed in their frames, etc. Some of the impacts have even displaced residents. The most common thing is going to be respiratory type irritation. That's going to be mostly from the smoke, not necessarily from the chemical itself. You have to understand that with the plant being on fire, the chemical is actually being consumed as part of the fire. Unfortunately, this type of fire produces smoke, and the smoke is an irritant.
TPC Group's chemical plant was rocked by a massive explosion in the early hours of Wednesday. The local Netherlands Volunteer Fire Department said a mandatory evacuation had been ordered for everyone living within a 1/2 mile radius of the plant. The TPC Group also said the explosion happened in what it said was a processing unit at around 1 a.m. local time. More than 200 people work at the facility, according to TPC Group's company website. The facility produces butadiene, a flammable gas used in the production of synthetic rubber and other petrochemicals such as butane. Local media said a shelter for those forced from their homes has been opened at a church in Netherlands. The investigation into the blast is still ongoing. Emergency workers pulled dust-covered corpses from the ruins of an earthquake that has claimed already 40 lives in Albania, as aftershocks hampered the second day of search efforts for survivors.
Tërmeti I fundit që unë kam ndodhur në brendësitë e banesës, thash se u shem pallati. Mund tyni ta shifni, kanë dalë edhe tullat. Suvaja që suvatoj si I thoni ju, na binin fytyrës, duke dalë.
The 6.4 magnitude earthquake that rattled the Balkan state early Tuesday morning was the most powerful and damaging in decades. With the help of dogs and 200 experts flown in from across Europe, rescuers raced against time to clear away the wreckage. 46 people have been pulled out alive so far and have been hospitalized, according to the Defense Ministry. The number of people who may still be buried in the rubble is unknown. Hundreds of aftershocks have continued to rattle the country, sparking panic and temporarily halting search efforts. The Health Ministry said among some 650 who were injured, at least 10 are seriously wounded. Thousands have been displaced either because their homes were severely damaged or because it's still unsafe to return home because of the aftershocks. The government declared Wednesday a national day of mourning and canceled festivities planned for Independence Day celebrations on November 28 and 29. Durres and Tumain were also put under a 30-day state of emergency. Seven Islamist extremists were sentenced to death in Bangladesh over a savage attack at a Dhaka cafe in 2016 that killed 22 people, mostly foreigners. A special anti-terrorism tribunal delivered the verdict in a crowded courtroom in the capital, with Judge Mojibur Rahman saying the attackers wanted to draw the attention of the Islamic State group. The brazen assault in July 2016 saw young men armed with assault rifles and machetes lay siege to the Holy Artisan Bakery Cafe in Dhaka's well-heeled Gulshow neighborhood. After a 10-hour standoff, military commandos stormed the eatery and freed more than 24 hostages. 9 Italians and 7 Japanese were among the 18 foreigners to be hacked or shot dead in the attack, while 2 policemen also died. All 5 militants were killed when the military stormed the cafe, which was popular with Westerners.
মৌলবাদী রাষ্ট্র হিসেবে তারা বিভিন্নভাবে করার চেষ্টা করেছে এবং আইএস তার এই দেশে ঘাঁটি আছে এগুলো তারা একটা জানান দিয়েছিল সন্ত্রাসীরা এবং এটার মাস্টার মাইন্ড তামিল চৌধুরী তার পরিকল্পনায় এই সমস্ত কাজগুলো হয়েছে। আমাদের পরিকল্পিতভাবে এই দেশকে অস্থিতিশীল করার জন্য এবং একটা মৌলবাদী রাষ্ট্রের খোঁজার জন্য এই ধরনের ঘটনাগুলো ঘটেছে।
যে সুখটা যে অভাবটা আসলে সেটা তো অপূরণীয়, সেটা কখনোই পূরণ হবে না। তবে এটা অন্তত এটাতে আমরা সান্ত্বনা পাবো। এটা সান্ত্বনার জায়গা যে যারা এই ঘটনার সাথে জড়িত ছিল তাদেরকে শাস্তির আওতায় আনা গেছে এবং সত্যকে আসলে প্রতিষ্ঠিত করার যে প্রচেষ্টা সেটা অব্যাহত আছে এবং সন্ত্রাসী বা জঙ্গিবাদ উদ্ভূতি যারা তাদেরকে আসলে বাংলার মাটি থেকে আমরা উৎখাত করার যে চেষ্টা চলেছে সেটা ধারাবাহিকতা অব্যাহত আছে। এটাই আমাদের দৃষ্টি।
The attacks were claimed by ISIS, but the government blamed a local militant group, the Jamayatul Mujahideen Bangladesh or JMB, and said their commanders were among the dead. Police have also blamed JMB for most of the extremist attacks in the South Asian nation since the late 1990s. The hostage crisis marked an escalation in extremist attacks following a spate of murders claimed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda of rights activists, gay people, foreigners, and religious minorities. The assault was also seen as a major blow to Bangladesh's image as a moderate Muslim nation, and the secular government launched a massive crackdown in its wake that saw more than 100 Islamist extremists killed and nearly 1,000 others arrested. But Dhaka has repeatedly denied that international jihadist networks have a presence in the country. U.S. Ambassador Gordon Sunderland, nominated by President Donald Trump, who provided key testimony in his impeachment hearings, was accused Wednesday of sexual misconduct by 3 women. The Portland Monthly published named accounts by 3 women who said that Sunderland, a wealthy hotel owner from Seattle, retaliated against them professionally after they rejected him sexually. One of the women, Janice Solis, said she met Sunderland in 2008 when she was seeking work in her position as a safety expert for hotels. She said Sunderland met her for lunch and offered her a job as, quote, my new hotel chick, before slapping her rear. Another woman, Nicole Vogel, said she met Sunderland in 2003 over dinner to seek investment in a new magazine. He then took her to a hotel he owned and invited her to see a room where he requested a hug and then, quote, grabs my face and goes to kiss me, she said. Sunderland, in a statement, rejected all the accusations and accused Vogel of underhanded journalism out of anger that he did not invest in the magazine. A lawyer for Sunderland told the magazine the article was timed to damage the ambassador's credibility in the impeachment inquiry. Gordon Sunderland, the U.S. envoy to the European Union, denied the allegations, with his lawyer alleging that the accusers were trying to taint his credibility in the impeachment inquiry. Sunderland donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration and was afterwards named ambassador to the European Union. Despite his support for President Trump, Ambassador Sunderland, testifying last week under oath before lawmakers, said he was following the president's orders in demanding that Ukraine investigate domestic rival Joe Biden before he would agree to a White House summit. The accusation is key evidence for House Democrats as they look to impeach the tycoon turned president. Two high-ranking politicians in Malta's government resigned on Tuesday, with a third suspending himself in the biggest political fallout to date from a widening probe into the brutal murder of investigative reporter Daphne Caruana Galizia. The resignations of Keith Schembri, the Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, and Tourism Minister Conrad Mezzi heap pressure on the government over its handling of Caruana Galizia's car bomb assassination in 2017. Sources said that Schembri had been called in for questioning by police after being fingered by the main suspect in the case, prominent businessman Vorjan Fenech. Fenech, who was arrested on his yacht last week as he tried to leave the country, has requested immunity to reveal what he knows. The mogul was released on bail on Tuesday. Investigators suspect Schembri may have tipped off may have tipped Fenech off, sparking the failed getaway bid, according to Maltese media. Journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed by a car bomb in October 2017. She had been reporting on political corruption for 30 years, including alleged money stashing by relatives of the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Muscat told reporters on Tuesday that Shembri had stepped down. Local media said the tourism minister also resigned, and Economy Minister Chris Cardona announced that he will suspend himself from his duties until the investigation is completed. The police have asked Cardona to provide information related to the unsolved murder. The investigation entered a new phase after an alleged middleman was arrested earlier this month. Last week, a business person who is reported to have a strong connection with the government was also arrested. Bolivia's exiled ex-president Evo Morales said Interpol issued blue notice against him during a press conference at the Mexican Journalist Club in Mexico City. Morales also talked prospects for his exile and not trying to run again for president. Let's listen in.
Quiero decirles, esta comunicación, notificación a los países de la notificación azul de Interpol, Argentina, Perú, Brasil, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador y México. Estaría ser buscado.
Interpol's alert has been turned on for Uruguay, as we heard, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico. The indigenous leader, in a press conference from Mexico, denounced that the new administration has not prosecuted those responsible for the 30 deaths registered in the context of the protests. However, he said they persecute and accuse of multiple crimes the militants and followers of the movement towards socialism, the Mas Morales Party. Some 20 former members of Bolivian ex-president Evo Morales' government have been holed up in Mexico's embassy in La Paz. Bolivia's foreign minister said on Tuesday, including 5 wanted for arrest. Among them is Morales' former top minister, Juan Ramon Quintana, who the caretaker government has accused of sedition and terrorism. Morales, who fled to Mexico after being granted political asylum following his November 10 resignation, has been accused of the same crimes. Elliot Abrams, U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela, told reporters in Washington, D.C. that Venezuela has paid about $5 billion in oil to Cuba and China and made military purchases from Russia worth hundreds of millions of dollars this year amid its ongoing economic crisis. He said that embattled President Nicolas Maduro has the money to buy food and medicine for his people, but has chosen not to.
Next week, on December 3rd, signatory countries of the Rio Treaty will meet in Bogota, Colombia, to consider, and we hope adopt, coordinated regional travel restrictions and visa denials against several dozen Maduro regime officials. These are new steps in growing regional efforts against the regime and in support of a return to democracy. The Venezuelan people have never benefited from oil revenues under the Maduro regime, which has used Venezuelan crude to pay for tools to repress its own people and siphoned billions of dollars to provide for regime members' bank accounts. In the course of this year, as an example, it has signed contracts for $209 million in military purchases from Russia, Sukhoi fighter jets, military helicopters, and other things. As you know, the United States has given more than $650 million to ease the plight of Venezuelans inside and outside their country. Our sanctions, in this case and always, do not cover food and medicine. The regime in Caracas can buy all the food and medicine it wants, including in the United States. And in fact, it has been buying food in the United States throughout this year. The problem for Venezuelans is it has not been buying enough. It has the money. The regime paid the Russian oil company Rosneft over $1.5 billion to reduce debt. It has reduced that debt $1.5 billion this year. It has sent China just under $3 billion worth of oil, much of it to reduce debts. It has sent about $900 million worth of oil to Cuba. That's about $5 billion that could have been spent on food and medicine, but was not. And the regime steals more and more money. In July, the Treasury Department sanctioned 3 stepsons of Nicolas Maduro for stealing money from the program that provides food for the poorest Venezuelans. Hundreds of millions of dollars went to no-bid and overvalued contracts that Treasury called profiting from starvation. And the regime uses those food programs for control of the people. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, in her report a few months ago, said that food program was used, quote, in a discriminatory manner based on political grounds and as an instrument of social control.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro enjoys support from China and Russia, which in turn accuses the United States of trying to carry out a coup in Venezuela. The United States in January launched a campaign of sanctions and other pressure to topple Maduro and back Juan Guaido, the head of the opposition-led National Assembly, whom Washington considers interim president. Abrams said the United States would not change course and still expected success. President Maduro presides over a crumbling state-directed economy that has seen eye-popping levels of inflation and triggered the exodus of millions of Venezuelans who cannot find basic necessities. Meanwhile, Colombian unions marked their second general strike in a week as tens of thousands poured onto the streets in protest against the government of right-wing President Iván Duque.
Yo creo que es momento de parar para cambiar. Nos tienen que escuchar a las minorías, a los estudiantes, a la clase trabajadora que se levanta todos los días para luchar por este país.
Public transport was largely shut down and shops and offices closed in the center of the capital as a series of protests that began with a 250,000-strong march last Thursday continued for a 7th consecutive day. Duque, under fire for his economic policies and corruption, launched a national dialogue Sunday with mayors and other officials in a bid to assuage popular anger. However, protest leaders reacted angrily when they were initially omitted from direct talks. The National Strike Committee, which groups unions, students, university lecturers, and indigenous groups, presented a list of 13 demands to the government, including the withdrawal of President Duque's proposed tax reforms and full compliance with the 2016 peace deal with the FARC guerrillas. But perhaps the most controversial is the call to dismantle the feared ESMAD riot police after the death Monday of an 18-year-old protester, Dylan Cruz, who was hit in the head by a tear gas canister. President Duque has yielded to some of the demands on tax reform, announcing the return of value-added tax to the poorest 20% of the population and benefits for companies that hire young people. At least 13 Iraqi protesters now were shot dead Thursday in clashes with security forces in the southern city of Nasiriyah amid a crackdown on anti-government unrest, according to medical and security sources. Around 50 others more were wounded, several in critical condition, when security forces tried to retake 2 bridges in the city that had been blocked by the protesters, according to sources, after reporting an earlier toll of only 2. Southern Iraq and the capital Baghdad have been gripped by nearly 2 months of rallies demanding a deep-rooted overhaul of the ruling system, seen by protesters as corrupt and inefficient. Now, the violence in Nasiriyah came a day after protesters torched the Iranian consulate in the Shiite city of Najaf in anger at the neighboring country they blamed for propping up the Baghdad government. The street violence in Iraq has left more than 350 people dead and some 15,000 wounded over the past 2 months. Iraq has been gripped by anti-government protests since October, when demonstrators hit the streets denouncing high levels of unemployment, widespread corruption, and a lack of basic services. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council condemned attacks against civilians and a UN base in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where locals accused the Blue Helmets of failing to protect them against deadly militia violence. Speaking at a closed meeting on recent anti-UN riots that left 6 people dead in Beni, in the east of the country, the acting president of the council, British Ambassador Karen Pearce, said the UN mission's mandate has in it the requirement to protect civilians. She also called for the mitigation of risks to civilians in offensive operations conducted by local security forces and UN troops. Concerns have grown over unrest in the region and the consequences that the violence could have on UN efforts to counter an Ebola epidemic. On Monday, rioters in Beni attacked a UN base in anger at their inaction after the killing of almost 80 people in the past month, deaths which were blamed on an armed group calling itself the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF. The ADF is accused of having killed hundreds and perhaps more than 1,000 people in Beni region since October 2014. The ADF began as an Islamist rebellion hostile to Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. It fell back into eastern DRC in 1995 and has recruited people of different nationalities, but appears to have halted raids inside Uganda. The Beni protests forced health workers to put on hold local efforts to combat an Ebola virus epidemic that has killed more than 2,000 people since it began in August of 2018. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization already evacuated 49 of its staff from a UN peacekeeping base in the city of Beni after locals stormed the base this week, demanding more protection from rebel groups. They warned of the impact on the fight against Ebola.
The security situation in Beni has definitely worsened overnight or throughout the last days. What we see is community violence against the security situation. That's very important for us because it's not a violence directed against the Ebola response, and it's not a violence directed against WHO. Where from our 120 staff in Beni overnight, 49 had to be evacuated over through the airport with escort and then flown out direction Goma. This operation might be still ongoing or is finished, but that's what it was so far. This message is that while 49 were relocated, 71 remain on the spot to this point to assure as good as possible the best or at least the minimum support to the Ebola response.
4 protesters were killed, according to the military, after clashes broke out and protesters stormed a UN camp over the perceived failure of UN peacekeepers to stop deadly attacks from militia groups. But he stressed that unlike several previous spikes in violence, the anger this time had not specifically targeted Ebola responders. But the insecurity is nonetheless seriously hampering the response. The Ebola virus is passed on by contact with the blood, body, fluids, secretions, or organs of an infected or recently deceased person. The work to halt the Ebola epidemic is based on vaccinating and carefully tracking anyone who has been in contact with those infected and the contacts of the contacts. Lynn Meyer said that while health workers typically are able to successfully track more than 90% of all contacts, on Monday they only reached 17%. In other news, French police removed several hundred migrants from a camp in northeast Paris. The latest move in a crackdown on the makeshift settlements that regularly spring up in the capital. More than 500 people, including 216 of the most vulnerable families and single women, have been brought to dedicated shelters or to centers for examining their situations. An official with the Ile-de-France Regional Authority encompassing Paris, told AFP. It was the 60th evacuation of a camp in Paris since the European migrant crisis began in 2015 and came 3 weeks after some 1,600 people were removed from 2 sprawling camps on the city's northern edges. The government has vowed to clear all camps in the capital by the end of the year after President Emmanuel Macron said France must end its lax approach to immigration. Critics say that unless the migrants are provided secure lodgings or a prospect of legal residency, many will simply return to the streets. More than 19,000 people have been removed from camps in or near Paris since the beginning of the year. And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Kahit gaano man kabigat ang iyong dinadala, patuloy pa rin ang
Net25 is now available on OSN, the largest entertainment network in the Middle East and North Africa.
Watch your favorite Net25 shows on OSN Channel 725, same day as the Philippines.
Net25 shows live and on demand, anytime, anywhere, on any mobile device on OSN Play.
Welcome back. Asian markets mostly fell on Thursday as optimism over the China-U.S. trade talks took a jolt after President Trump signed into law a bill supporting Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests, prompting an angry response from Beijing. President Trump on Wednesday put his name to the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which requires the president to annually review the city's favorable trade status and threatens to revoke it if the territory's freedoms are quashed. He also agreed to legislation banning sales of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other equipment used by Hong Kong security forces in putting down protests that have racked the city since June and have battered its economy. The president spoke of respect for his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping and said he hoped all sides could amicably settle their differences. Now, Hong Kong fell 0.2% and Shanghai ended down 0.5%, while China's yuan was also slightly lower. Tokyo finished 0.1% lower. Singapore slipped 0.4% and Seoul dropped 0.5%, while Taipei, Jakarta, and Manila also retreated. However, Sydney and Mumbai rose 0.2% and Wellington added 0.8% after data showed a pickup in New Zealand business confidence. China will import more than twice as much pork as last year, according to the Commerce Ministry on Thursday, after hog herds were devastated and prices of the staple meat soared following a major African swine fever outbreak.
二是鼓励增加进口，继续鼓励进口企业拓展多元化进口来源，积极增加优质肉类的进口。预计全年 肉类进口量将超过600万吨，其中进口猪肉及其副产品将超过300万吨。
Chinese authorities have scrambled to control prices, even going as far as tapping the country's pork reserve as the swine fever crisis could become a political and economic liability for the state. To minimize pork price volatility, China will encourage the increase of imports and continue to encourage the expansion of import enterprises, according to Commerce Ministry spokesman Gao Feng. More than 1 million pigs have been culled due to the widespread outbreak since African swine fever appeared in August of 2018, according to official statistics. But that is widely considered to be an underestimate. This in turn has also pushed up prices of other meats, including beef, chicken, duck, and eggs, as consumers switch to other protein sources. To meet demand, Beijing has increased pork imports, with shipments from the European Union rising 37% between January and April, according to the European Commission figures. Brazil has also become a big source of imports. Despite weak economic growth and international sanctions, the Russian stock exchange, based in Moscow, has some of the best results in the world this year. Take a look.
But I think investors now know how to work and operate in the environment of existing sanctions. The fear of additional sanctions was something that put them, made them to hold up several years ago. But now, as this fear is largely gone, they know how to operate in the existing framework of sanctions. But if you look at the country's balance sheet, right, there is no debt. There are reserves of more than half $500 million. There is no budget deficit, so the balance sheet of the country is very strong, and this is how Russia is different from most of other emerging markets. The Russian corporates are feeling very well. They're generating good profits and they are paying high dividends. Dividend yield in Russia is close to 7%, which is very, very good in international context.
German luxury car maker Audi said it planned to slash 9,500 jobs in Germany by 2025 as part of a massive overhaul to help finance a costly switch to electric vehicles. The job cuts will be achieved through an early retirement program and natural turnover at its 2 German plants, the company said in a statement. At the same time, the Volkswagen subsidiary said it would create 2,000 new jobs in the areas of electromobility and digitization as it pivots to the smarter, cleaner cars of tomorrow. The shakeup comes as Audi, like other car makers, grapples with slowing demand in a weaker global economy, tougher pollution rules, and the huge investments needed for the battery-powered era. Ford, BMW, Hyundai, Toyota, Audi, car manufacturers around the world are betting on electric cars as they introduce new models at the Los Angeles Auto Show. Consumer demand is growing for electrified vehicles, according to Peter Nota, a member of the board of management of BMW, who introduced the Mini electric model, which will be available for the U.S. market. Take a look.
Well, customer demand is growing for electrified vehicles, partly because of regulation, also emission standards, but also partly because customer demand is increasing, and also because infrastructure is improving. Not everywhere, but in areas where charging stations are widely available, we see demand for electrified vehicles also increasing. We've announced that by 2023 we will have 25 electrified vehicles on the road. Half of them, roughly 12, will be fully electric, the other half will be plug-in hybrids. BMW, in fact, is a pioneer when it comes to electrification. We started in 2013 with the BMW i3, which is still selling extremely well. We have electrified our full range of products with plug-in hybrids, so all the way from our 2 series up to the 7 series. Take, for example, our new BMW X3 plug-in hybrid, BMW X5 plug-in hybrid, which are hitting the market soon. So
the U.S. is the second largest global market behind China for electric vehicles. According to the Edison Electric Institute, there were nearly 1.2 million electric vehicles on U.S. roads at the end of March, with sales jumping 81% in 2018 from the previous year. Now, that number of electric vehicles in the U.S. is projected to reach 18.7 million in 2030. Eagle News will be right back.
Mga kababayan, lalo na sa mga OFWs sa Middle East at North Africa, may good news kami para sa inyo. Mapapanood na ninyo ang Net25 at iba pang Filipino channels na hatid ng OSN sa presyong abot kaya. Libre ng box at installation, walang admin fees at no extra charges. Saktong entertainment na sakto lang sa budget mo. Bumisita na sa pinakamalapit na OSN store o dealer and subscribe now! Sa Net25 at OSN, siguradong at home ka dito.
The world must more than halve greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years by some 30 billion tons to try to limit average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That is according to the UN Environment Program. Citing bleak findings from its latest report, the head of the UNEP Danish Technology Institute partnership, John Christensen, warned that if you look at the global emissions, they are still going up.
If you look at the global emissions, they are still going up. We had little hope a couple of years ago that the CO2 part of the emissions had basically been stable for a few years, and we hoped that that indicated a stabilization. But in 2017 and 2018, we don't have the 19 numbers yet. Emissions have been going up, and the CO2 emissions have been going up the last year by 2%. So that's actually above the average of the last 10 years. It's coming because economic growth, especially in developing countries, is really high. And while the OECD countries don't really add to the CO2, they don't really come down a lot either. But the main growth is in developing countries due to economic growth and still relatively high energy and carbon intensity in the energy systems.
At this same press conference in Geneva, Inger Andersen, UNEP Executive Director, blamed climate procrastination by governments before calling for a 7.6% reduction in global emissions every year between now and 2030.
Now, because of climate procrastination, which we have essentially had during these 10 years, we are looking at a 7.6% reduction every year. Is that possible? Absolutely. Will it take political will? Yes. Will we need to have the private sector lean in? Yes. But the science tells us that we can do this.
More than 5,000 people in the Democratic Republic of Congo have died of measles so far this year, and practically all of them are children under the age of 5, according to UNICEF. The UNICEF representative in DRC, Edward Better, released a statement on Wednesday citing violence and insecurity, lack of access to health care, and a shortage of vaccines and medical kits as some of the reasons for the high death toll. Cultural beliefs and traditional healthcare practices also contribute to children not getting the vaccinations and other treatment they need. The World Health Organization says the DRC measles outbreak is the largest outbreak worldwide.
Right now, the DRC outbreak is the largest outbreak worldwide. It's one of the largest that we've seen. It's all over the country. It's not restricted to certain parts of the country. And we estimate, the country estimates that there have been, as I said, over 250,000 cases and over 5,000 deaths attributable to measles, which of course is more than Ebola, substantially more than Ebola, and most of these are in children and babies.
Measles is a highly contagious disease caused by a virus that attacks mainly children. The most serious complications include blindness, brain swelling, diarrhea, and severe respiratory infections. The rapid spread of measles in DRC has garnered far less attention than the Ebola epidemic that has also been raging in the east of the country since August 2018. That outbreak has killed some 2,200 people. Efforts to rein in the spread of both Ebola and measles are meanwhile being hampered by violence and unrest across the country and especially in the east. The World Health Organization said a measles epidemic raging in Samoa has killed 37 people, blaming an anti-vaccine messaging campaign for leaving the Pacific Island nation vulnerable to the spread of the virus. The UN Health Agency warned that a steep decline in vaccination rates in Samoa, a Pacific Ocean island nation halfway between Hawaii and New Zealand, had paved the way for a huge outbreak with more than 2,500 cases in a country of just 200,000 people. The death toll has been rising steadily since the country declared a national measles epidemic in mid-October. WHO said another 5 people had died Wednesday, bringing the total number of deaths to 37.
Samoa is truly tragic, especially when they had previously high rates of vaccination, and now with this recent slide of vaccination rates, we have seen a huge outbreak. Relative to the country size, it is a very large one, with 2,500 cases at least recorded, and as of last night, 37 deaths. There is an overwhelming number of cases now, and that has taken up almost all of the beds available in the national hospital system. What we're seeing now is many patients coming with diabetes complications and pregnancy complications, etc., because the outpatient clinics of the hospitals have shut down.
Unfortunately, in Samoa, part of what is happening there has to do with some social messaging around an anti-vaccine group, and this is now being measured in the lives of children who have died in the course of this outbreak.
Business estimates.
Russian President Vladimir Putin told the UEFA president that his country would do its best to organize the Euro 2020 football tournament as Moscow risks a possible 4-year doping ban.
Сделаем все для того, чтобы не подвести вас, не подвести болельщиков, игроков.
On Tuesday, a World Anti-Doping Agency, the WADA, source said, however, that the Euro 2020 football tournament would be excluded from the potential ban. St. Petersburg is one of 12 locations across Europe scheduled to host matches in next year's tournament.
Для нас это имеет немаленькое значение, потому что когда проводился первый чемпионат, 60 лет назад, сборная Советского Союза выиграла ее.
Russia pulled out all the stops to host the football extravaganza last year, the most important event in the country since the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics. On Monday, anti-doping watchdog WADA's Compliance Review Committee recommended a 4-year sporting ban against Russia over falsified lab data it received from the country. If WADA chiefs adopt the review committee's recommendations on December 9, Russia faces exclusion from key sporting events, including the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. However, on Tuesday, the WADA source, speaking on condition of anonymity, told the AFP the European Championships were not a major event. And finally, in our news, astronomers have discovered a black hole in the Milky Way, so huge that it challenges existing models of how stars evolve, according to researchers. Take a look. LB-1 is 15,000 light years from Earth and has a mass 70 times greater than the Sun, according to the journal Nature. The Milky Way is estimated to contain 100 million stellar black holes, but LB-1 is twice as massive as anything scientists thought, according to Liu Jifeng, a National Astronomical Observatory of China professor who led the research. He said black holes of such mass should not even exist in our galaxy, according to most of the current models or stellar evolution. Scientists generally believe that there are two types of black holes. The more common stellar black holes, up to 20 times more massive than the Sun, form when the center of a very big star collapses in on itself. Supermassive black holes are at least 1 million times bigger than the Sun, and their origins are uncertain. But researchers believe that typical stars in the Milky Way shed most of their gas through stellar winds, preventing the emergence of a black hole the size of LB-1, according to Mr. Liu. LB-1 was discovered by an international team of scientists using China's sophisticated LAMOST telescope. Additional images from two of the world's largest optical telescopes, Spain's Gran Telescopio Canarias and the Keck 1 telescope in the United States, confirmed that the size of LB-1, which the National Astronomical Observatory of China said was, quote, nothing short of fantastic. And that's the news for tonight. Join us online and here again tomorrow evening. From all of us here at Eagle News, I'm Alma Angeles, always one with 25. Good night.